Welcome to Science of Slink, the evidence-based poll podcast with me, your host, Dr. Rosy Boa, research doctor, not a medicine doctor. None of this is medical advice. Today, listen, you're either going to be like, this is the coolest shit I've ever heard. I immediately have to read more about this, or you're going to be like, duh, I don't get why this is interesting. And if you're in the latter camp, that's okay. If you're in the former camp, I think you're going to be with me in it. So today I want to talk about distributed creativity and why when we do particularly improvisational dance together with other people, not just alone on our own, why it's different and some of the benefits we might get from that. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of, I don't know, kind of like a personal story, personal background. So I don't know, some of y'all know this and some of y'all, danced with me way back in the day. But from 2012 to about 2020, I did a lot of in-person freestyling with other folks. I did some doubles. I did just a lot of stuff in person, which I very much enjoyed. And then in 2020, I stopped doing that for COVID reasons. And also, I think 2018, I started teaching. And then during COVID, I switched to teaching online. And, for a while I was dancing with a lot of folks online, and then I moved and I found a studio and they were, still masking, had HEPA filters, all that stuff. And I have an immunosuppressed family member, so I'm a little bit more cautious than I would say your average person when it comes to COVID. Really cannot be bringing that home and giving that to folks. So when the in-person precautions started to peter off, and also a lot of the kind of the online options kind of died away, that's actually when I founded my studio because I was just not able to find the type of training space I really wanted online, where there was freestyle together with people. And also it was really evidence-based and, building on what we know about good techniques and best practices around movement and, science. You listen to the podcast, you know what I'm into. And one of the things that I really missed in that interim when I wasn't really dancing with people, I was just dancing by myself. I did have a space, which was great. I was continue to be very grateful, was very grateful at the time, is that technically I wasn't actually doing that bad, right? Not to toot my own horn, I know a lot about pole. I know about teaching pole. I have a trick I want to try. I can break it down into its component parts and condition them together and work on them on their own and make progress that way. So technically, I was actually doing fine. I was learning new stuff. I was building strength and flexibility. I was ticking boxes. But what suffered the most was my freestyle, which is tragic because that's the thing that I care about the most. That's the thing that I like the most. That's like the core of what dance is to me and what keeps me going and why I do it. So when I was doing it by myself and I didn't have that, that social environment, I didn't do things as often. When I did do them, I didn't do them for as long. And also, I just had less variety in my movement. I just did fewer distinct different movements. And that's something that I noticed pretty, just in my body. I noticed that I was doing it, that I was sort of getting stuck in ruts. And we've talked before in other episodes about, how exercising with other people, having that social support can help you show up more consistently, can help with motivation, can help you push yourself harder if that's something you're interested in doing, can help you exercise for longer stretches of time. I think the staying motivated as a home pole dancer episode is a good one if you want to sort of hear more about the research on that. But previously I hadn't really dug into the creativity aspects of it. And, how does working with other people encourage you to do new things? Because that has very much been my experience both as a dancer, as a mover, and also as a teacher. I really noticed that folks who are able to form connections with other people who are interested in freestyle really develop a much wider vocabulary, really have access to a lot more different stuff in their body, different styles, different tempos, because they're getting the cross-pollination from moving with other folks. And that's been my experience as well, right? The more chances I get to dance with other people and freestyle with other people, the more rich and textured and varied my own freestyle is. And to be perfectly blunt, the more fun I have. So that was my experience. And, like I often do when I have a question, I was like, all right, so who's researching this? Because one of the wonderful things about certainly the way science has been done up until now is that if there's something that you're interested in, probably someone is doing work on it and you just got to find it, which is a challenge in and of its own. If this is something that you're struggling with, may I recommend reference librarians? They know about knowledge and how to help you find shit. And yeah, shout out to librarians. Y'all are great. I actually happen to already know sort of the direction to look here, and it got me in a direction that I was not expecting, which is it got me to literature that's building on the distributed cognition literature. Now, if you're not familiar with distributed cognition, I think a lot of folks aren't. It's mid 90s, I'd say, is when it started kicking off. Definitely something that I was running across people working on, pretty heavily in, the 2010s, etc. Hutchins is sort of the founder of the theory. It's a theory. I call it theory. But basically, the core idea here, the core premise is in opposition to sort of a way of thought that had been the predominant one previously, which is that cognition happens in your brain. And you may be saying, Rosie, cognition does happen in your brain. Yes, and I think Hutchins and a lot of people who worked on this literature and this way of looking at things since would say it also happens elsewhere, right? So the sort of first place that I ran into this literature was in looking at writing, right? And looking at the difference between cultures where information transmission is primarily oral and cultures where information transmission is primarily literary. So of course we are in a literary culture. If you have clicked on a YouTube podcast link or, Spotify or wherever you're listening to this, if you use the internet, congratulations, you're in a literary culture. You're probably even hyperliterate, right? Like you're probably at the point where you can't look at text and not read it. Hopefully. I know that, if you are someone who struggles with adult literacy, that is a genuine struggle. I'm dyslexic, but in a way where reading is not often a challenge. Let me put it that way. I don't want to get too deep into it. But anyway, the point is, if you interact with writing a lot and if you write things down, the argument here is that part of your cognitive processes are happening externally to you, right? So a great example of this is a to-do list. A to-do list is a list of things I've taken from my brain that I've put somewhere else that are still part of my cognition, right? And when I go back and I refer to that to-do list, it's like a little enclave, right? Like a little, I've offloaded is the term, right? Some portion of what I am doing to someone else. We also can have things like shared cognition, right? So this would be things like teamwork. If you've ever worked at a job and had coworkers, right? You're all working towards the same thing. No two people have exactly overlapping knowledge, but together, everyone in the company has all the knowledge needed to make the company run. I mean, hopefully, right? Or there's a lot of talk of this in the design. So I think an example you hear of a lot is like cockpits, like cockpit design for pilots. There are things that are sort of externalized into, the apparatus that they don't have to have in their brain, but they still have access to, right? And I think it's part of a larger epistemology of thinking, is a larger way of approaching knowledge, a belief about knowing that says, okay, we are not brains in jars, right? You have a body and that affects you. That has consequences. You are a person that has consequences. You exist in a social and a cultural context, right? There's, I don't know, if you're familiar with, again, back to epistemology, if you're familiar with sort of like positivism, really this is one of those fields where it really comes to a head, right? Like, can introspection be a genuine place of knowledge creation? And I think some people would genuinely say no, and other people would genuinely say yes. And I think the distributed cognition people would say also conversations, right? Like interactions you have with other people can be a place of genuine knowledge creation. So distributed cognition, it is very interesting, right? But this is also talking about thinking. It's talking about cognition. What about creativity? Because that's what I was talking about, right? That's how we got into this in the first place. Well, wouldn't you know, distributed creativity is also something that people have been working on. So Sawyer and Desutter, 2009, distributed creativity, how collective creations emerge from collaboration was sort of the paper that kicked this off. And it was in Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. And they were specifically looking at an improv theater troupe. And what they were saying was like, hey, if we're talking about creativity, if we're thinking about making new things, right, where the end of this process is the product of creation, in this case, an improv theater performance, we cannot have any meaningful model of this form of creation that is one person is doing it in their mind, which previously had really been sort of the default assumption in the creativity research, right? It was really about like, how does a person come up with an idea? And there had been some work up to that point on brainstorming and sort of like corporate creativity a little bit more. And their big point was that some things have to be done together, and we need to have a way as, psychologists studying creativity to be able to talk about this act of communal creation, perhaps is something that's distributed, perhaps is something that we can think of as parallel to shared cognition. So just quoting from them here, situations where collaborating groups of individuals collectively generate a shared creative project is what they were creating this concept of distributed creativity to describe, drawing on, again, that idea of distributed cognition. So that's the general background. And I think we can all think of lots of examples of creative acts where doing them with other people is really important. And part of the reason why I think this literature in particular, is something that I've been running into and reading more in, is because they also talk about improvisation quite a lot, because improvisation is, the improvised thing is the product of creation. I think it's something that's really appealing to folks who are looking at creativity. So there's been quite a bit of work on distributed creativity in music, in improvisational theater. I try not to read. Some of y'all know I'm a TTRPG enjoyer, tabletop role-playing game. Listen, if you were under any misapprehensions that I was anything other than an enormous nerd, please discard them now. I'm really into TTRPGs, and I think that this is a place where, there are solo TTRPGs, but most games are designed to be played together with a group of people, and what emerges is a collaborative act, right? Like if you've ever run something, like you've been a dungeon master, run a TTRPG, then you're going in, you have ideas, you have things that might happen, but really you don't know what's going to happen because it's a collaborative act that you're doing with other people together. And that active product of creativity, in this case like the TTRPG session, is something that happens across the table that everyone has a hand in to a greater or lesser degree. I tend to be a very collaborative GM, so a very high degree for me. We're not going to talk about TTRPGs anymore in this episode, but a place where this also happens is, drumroll, dance. And that brings me to the paper that I think is most relevant for what we're going to be what we do in the studio. Well, our spare bedrooms, our living rooms, what we do in our homes where our poles are, or wherever we have space to move, and that is improvisational dance. So this paper, Leach and Stevens 2020, Relational Creativity and Improvisation in Contemporary Dance in Interdisciplinary Science Reviews, was the paper that I read that made me want to be like, I gotta do a podcast episode on this. So this is an experimental paper. And basically, they are building on this idea of distributed creativity, building on this other idea of distributed cognition, and being like, okay, so how does having multiple dancers moving together change what they do in terms of improvised movement? And I will say they were in Australia, they were in a studio, and these people were physically together. They were not looking at people dancing online like we are, but I don't have any reason to believe that it wouldn't also apply to online, especially because some of the research looking at do social effects of motivation for exercise hold online as they do in person? The answer is yeah, they do. Given that background, given the fact that I have found dancing with people online to be very generative and improve my own creativity, I don't a priori have a reason to believe that this wouldn't also apply to online. That's just what that sidebar is about. But basically what they did was they had dancers improvise, and they had some prompts. The prompts were circle, cylinder, and then square. So it's dance a circle, dance a cylinder, dance a square. And aren't you, people who take my freestyle flow classes, aren't you glad that I give you juicier prompts than that? I know they're trying to control for things. I don't know, maybe we can recreate this research, and I'll give you these prompts and you can see what you think. But they had the dancers improvise for 2 minutes and then 4 minutes. There were 2 batches, either alone, in a duo, or in a trio. And what they did was they notated the number of new movements they did during this improvisation session. And then also they had folks do a questionnaire, right? And I think they had the dancers do a questionnaire, and then they also had an outside observer taking notes on the questionnaire. And the way this was phrased was that this was improvisation that would then later be made into choreographies. They were trying to come up with new movements. This wasn't necessarily a situation where improvisational performance was the goal, like it is for me, at least. I'm an improv performer. What can I say? And I think the studies were really interesting. So the first thing that they found was that the number of new movements produced was highest in the solo condition. So the dancers did more novel movements when they were dancing alone. However, the quality and relevance of the new movements were higher in the duo and trio conditions. So when dancers were dancing together, they found that the movements that they created were more relevant to the exercise that they were doing, and also the quality was better, right? Which is really interesting to me. And I will say, I think the number of new movements probably wouldn't actually obtain. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. Online, as someone who's done, contact improv and partner work before in pole, I tend to move a lot more slowly when I'm improvising with somebody, particularly if like there's pole work involved, right? I'm not gonna like they're up the pole. I'm like, all right, time for spin on this spin pole. I'm just gonna chuck myself in there. No, no, no. We're gonna ease. We're gonna ooze. We're gonna take our time. We're not gonna surprise nobody. So I think that, certainly I would do fewer things if I were improvising than if I were doing in a group than I would if I were solo. But very interesting that having more partners in this creative exercise created more relevant and more interesting movements. It seemed to improve the overall quality of the improvisation, which again, very much is in keeping with my experience, which I don't find super surprising because again, I tend to feel better about my improvisational movement, my freestyle movement when I'm doing it with folks, when I have, some degree of audience or observer in when I have like some degree of community around it, right? So anyway, really interesting study as always. All of these studies, all these citations will be down there, so that the original distributed cognition, if you want to go read in that, really interesting body of work. I'm a pretty embodied cognition person. You'll never guess that as a movement professional, and I'm kind of into that idea. May or may not be something that you're into. That's perfectly fine. And then, of course, the distributed creativity paper, where that's first proposed, that 2009 paper, Sawyer and DeZutter, and then this 2020 paper, which is Leach and Stevens, again looking at improvisational dance. And like I said, I think this creativity line of research is really relevant to us because they do look at improvisation a lot across different types of disciplines. So big takeaways, I think one is that we got to remember that we are not brains in jars alone on a shelf. We exist in a social and cultural context that we cannot extract ourselves from. And people, I don't know. Listen, individualism is a hell of a drug. And I think we all, if we are in, the Western industrialized space, I think we tend to have that pop up a lot, right? That white supremacy culture, it's got some kick to it. But I mean, the fact is humans are social, right? We're not eusocial. We're not bees, but we do exist in a social context and we do have culture, right? I think a lot of the things that we do as humans, we have to do with other people. Great example here, language, right? Like you have to learn language through interaction or else it just doesn't work. And that is just a fact of being human, right? And doing things with other people. And that includes freestyle dance. It makes them better and makes them possible in a lot of contexts. And that's okay. And that's normal. And you don't have to come up with every new thing and new idea yourself. And in fact, I encourage you to, if that is an idea that you have in your head, just maybe tug on it a little bit every so often and see if eventually you might be able to like peel that out and toss that, because it's just going to make you unhappy, right? You're denying a fundamental truth of how people work. I thought it was really interesting. Feel free to read more deeply in the literature. Always happy to chat in the comments. I think pretty much every place where this is posted, you can leave comments. And if you can't find a place for it, I got a contact form on my website, Slink Through Strength. And if you're like, Rosy, you've convinced me. I too wish to freestyle with other people. Well, you know where you can do that online. It's on my online dance studio, slinkthroughstrength.com. And I've actually recently added a Tuesday class at 1 p.m. Eastern, which is seeming to work pretty good for folks. I think I've hit that sweet spot where US West Coast and Europe can both sort of show up to the same class. And then Wednesday nights at 7:30, also Eastern p.m. I also teach freestyle flow. And then once a month, roughly, I'll teach a community flow class, which is sort of similar, but that's free. And that's just for folks to, come, move in community, meet people, hang out, move your body, have a nice time, and just chill. I would love to have you come move with me. Beginners very welcome. I provide lots of structure. And coming up, in the medium near future, dates TBD, I'm going to be running a series for more advanced freestylers who are like, I want to be pushed. I want to get weird with it and with other people who are also interested in getting weird with it and really, really try to push them boundaries a bit and really get into the creativity of it. And I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah. So stay tuned, sign up to my newsletter, follow me on socials. I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Instagram, and yeah, hope I'll get a chance to dance with you soon. And if I don't, hopefully you're dancing with other people, right? You've got a place where you can do that, you've got a space where you can do that, and you can really connect and build together. And that's what I want for you in your life right now. So have a good one. I look forward to talking with you or slinking with you very soon. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and look out for each other. Bye.